Well, we left off with fundamentalism, and we were looking at that coalition of fundamentalisms and the movement within it. And we last left our time together talking about our good friend J. Gresham Machen. Well, after Machen founded Westminster Seminary, he was kicked out of his denomination. And just as he founded a new seminary, he founded a new denomination. It eventually became the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. And then, on the very first day of the year 1937, Machen died, January 1, 1937. Well, I want to pick up this story of American Christianity with the rise of evangelicalism. Now, on the one hand, we can say evangelicalism has been around long before the 1940s. In fact, I often like to say evangelicalism actually began with a joke. And it began with a joke told by none other than George Whitefield. So, are you ready? Whitefield would stand up in front of audiences, and of course, you know, the guy would die and he would come before St. Peter at the pearly gates. And he asked St. Peter, St. Peter, are there Anglicans in heaven? And St. Peter would say, oh, no, sir. There are no Anglicans in heaven. Well, of course, that would get a laugh from all the Congregationalists, right? Then Whitefield would say, well, then tell me, St. Peter, are there Presbyterians in heaven? Oh, no, there are no Presbyterians in heaven. Tell me, St. Peter, are there Congregationalists in heaven? No, sir, there are no Congregationalists in heaven. Well, this man stumped, and he finally says, well, are there people of the Methodist way? Which is how they referred to Methodism as it first began. Are there people of the Methodist way in heaven? No, there are no people of the Methodist way in heaven. Well, at this point, our man is totally exasperated, and so he says, well, then tell me, St. Peter, who is in heaven? And St. Peter says, Christians, sir. Christians are in heaven. Now, it was a joke. It always got a laugh, especially when he picked on Baptists. But did you see I purposefully left Baptists out of that? Because I've been picking on them throughout this entire series. And now as we're getting close to the end, I want them to be my friends, so I backed off a little. But the point of the joke is this. The gospel transcends denominational boundaries. And in one sense, when Whitefield made that joke, that was the birth of evangelicalism. Evangelicalism is, at the core of its identity, a non-denominational, I might even go as far as to say non-doctrinal emphasis on the gospel. It has really at its core the evangel. And the evangel, as we all know, is the gospel, the good news of salvation in Jesus Christ. You must be born again. And that is what will get you into heaven, not your denominational affiliation or commitment or affirmation, right? And so very much a part of evangelicalism can find its roots long, long before the 1940s, going back to the First Great Awakening. Even if we go back to the Reformation and we think of the Lutheran Church, it was known as the Evangelicia, the gospel church, the emphasis on conversion. You must be born again. But when we're talking about American evangelicalism, we're talking about this movement that began post-World War II, almost immediately on the heels of World War II, and flourished in that second half of the 20th century, in many ways dominated the second half of the 20th century of American Christianity. And now we find ourselves in this current moment, and in our final episode together, we will look at this current moment and try to think about, well, what's on the horizon and what awaits for the American church. That are we in a post-evangelical moment or some kind of post-evangelical phase? But what we do know for certain is that this movement began in earnest in the mid-1940s and flourished through the rest of the 20th century. Two key figures in this story of evangelicalism. One is Carl F.H. Henry. Now, Carl Henry he spoke German, but he was American-born and had German immigrant parents, ended up at Wheaton College, was a stellar student. He had been a newspaper man before he went to Wheaton. He was an expert typist, and so his senior year as a student at Wheaton, they needed a freshman typing course professor. And so before Carl Henry even graduated from college, he was teaching his first college class. And I do believe he met his wife. I think she was a student in that freshman typing class. After his time at Wheaton, he pursued a seminary degree. He and a fellow colleague of his, E.J. Carnell, together went to Boston University to earn PhDs. Now, that was very intentional, and it was a way of responding to what Henry saw as one of the drawbacks of fundamentalism. So to really understand evangelicalism, we have to understand this focus on Henry's and his criticism of fundamentalism. What Henry saw coming out of fundamentalism, especially a fundamentalism of the late 20s through the 1930s, was too much of a separatism. That fundamentalism had sort of retreated from the American cultural conversation and had retreated into its own enclaves of its own educational institutions, its own radio stations, its own publishing houses, essentially its own subculture. Carl Henry thought this is sort of the opposite of what Jesus calls us to do in Matthew 5-7. And it's very interesting what Jesus says there. You know, he talks about, you don't take your light and hide it under a bushel, do you? No, you put your light on the table for everyone to see. And the idea of taking your light and hiding it under a bushel is sort of, withdrawing from culture is how Henry understood that metaphor. That here we are, Christians, we are to be a light shining in a dark place, but what did we do? We sort of retreated to our fundamentalist fortresses so that we would not be malaffected by culture. But then what happens on the opposite direction? Jesus talks about how the salt has lost its flavor, it's actually useless. Well, that's cultural accommodation. The salt tastes like everything else, doesn't have that preservative, doesn't have that distinct flavor. And so Jesus' call to the church, or call to Christians as disciples to be salt, is to say we must be distinctive. We must not be of this world. But his call for us to be a light shining in a dark place says that we are called in this world. So we are to be, as Jesus says, right? In the world, but not of it. We are to be both salt and light. Henry felt that much of fundamentalism had caused the church to retreat from culture, to no longer be a light shining in a dark place. And the reality is, we don't have to run from the academy. We don't have to run from these hard questions. We can go toe-to-toe with those in the academy. So he heads off to Boston, gets his PhD. So does Carnell. So this is Henry. A significant moment in Carl Henry's life is 1947. He publishes the book, The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism. And essentially, he calls the church out for not being a light in the world. And he calls the church to be more culturally engaged. That becomes a true identifier, a hallmark of this evangelicalism from post-World War II to the end of the 20th century. To be engaged in culture and to bring Christianity to bear upon culture. Well, Carl Henry goes on to get appointed to a professor at the fledgling Fuller Theological Seminary, which was sort of the flagship seminary in the 1950s for this young evangelical movement. But almost as soon as he gets there, he gets called to Washington, D.C. to be the editor for the first time in the first year, the fledgling year of the launch of a magazine founded by Billy Graham and founded by his father-in-law, Nelson Bell, and that magazine was called Christianity Today. It was founded in 1956. Henry was the first editor. And in those days, Christianity Today was a pretty heavy lifting magazine. It had some meaty theological articles to it. And I have Exhibit A that I think you all might enjoy. This is an early Christianity Today issue. As you can see from the moon on the cover, this is from 1969. Now, the reason why I mention this is because all of you Ligonier students might especially appreciate a particular article in here that I will find in a moment, and it is Existential Autonomy and Christian Freedom. Now, that's not the typical magazine title you would see in Christian magazines today. But going back to Christianity Today of the 50s and 60s, it was the kind of thing they were publishing. Of course, the interesting thing about that article is not just the title, Existential Autonomy and Christian Freedom, but the author. And the author is none other than Robert C. Sproul. Now, you might not recognize that name because very quickly he changed it to R.C. Sproul. But this was the second thing that Dr. Sproul published. It was an early edition of Christianity Today. Henry was still the editor at this time. He took a 1-year leave of absence from Fuller Seminary, and it just kept becoming 2, and then 3, and then I think 10, and then I think 15. So he just stayed on the helm as the editor of Christianity Today. Carl Henry was a significant figure of that early evangelicalism that sort of wanted to jump back into the arena that they had felt fundamentalism had abandoned. But the other figure who far and away captured the attention of American culture and is the towering figure over American evangelicalism is none other than Billy Graham. Now, Graham is interesting for a lot of reasons. Number one, as a 16-year-old, he has his moment of personal commitment to Jesus Christ at a revival meeting. This is in 1936. So he's got one foot squarely in the fundamentalist world, and specifically one foot in that revivalist camp within the fundamentalist coalition. He starts off his education at Bob Jones College. At this time, Bob Jones is in Tennessee. Bob Jones Sr. recognized the dynamic nature that Billy Graham possessed, even as a teenager, and took him under his wing as a bit of a Timothy to Paul. But Billy Graham didn't quite agree with the separatist notions and the militant sort of perspective of Bob Jones, and he ends up going to the opposite end of the spectrum of Christian colleges. He too goes to Wheaton. After his Wheaton years, he works for Youth for Christ. He gets appointed president of the Northwestern Schools, which had a school, a college, and a seminary up in Minnesota and Minneapolis. And then in 1949, he holds a crusade in Los Angeles. And the tent is set up, and Graham comes to speak, and all of a sudden, thousands start showing up. And some newspaper reporter reported on it, and it made its way into one of the papers of William Randolph Hearst. This is the newspaper magnate. And so Hearst, sitting up in his Hearst castle, right, midway between LA and San Francisco, is reading this little piece on Graham and becomes totally captivated by Graham, not because of his message, but because this is a clean-cut, great-looking guy who's gonna sell newspapers for me. And so William Randolph Hearst sends a 2-word telegram to all of his editors of all of his papers that just peppered the United States. And the telegram was simply this: Puff Graham. Now, that's not Graham Puffs. That's a breakfast cereal that you eat. The telegram was Puff Graham. In other words, give this guy attention. Make this guy the story. Give him headlines. Years later, Graham said that, of course, God was working behind the scenes in all of this, and he owes anything that ever happened in his ministry to the hand of God upon it. But he said, from a human perspective, it was that telegram from William Randolph Hearst. And very quickly, Billy Graham became an American figure. In 1957, he hosts a crusade in Madison Square Garden in New York City. They rented it for a week. They had such crowds, they rented it for a second week. Such crowds, a third week. 16 weeks was the New York City crusade. And between Carl F.H. Henry and his book and his challenge for the church to not abandon culture, not withdraw from culture, but engage culture as the light in a dark place, and with Billy Graham spreading a very focused, simple message: you must be born again. That was the essence of what Graham was preaching. That launched evangelicalism. In fact, we'll get into this in our final episode together, but people who look at this and say, well, is there still an evangelical coalition, and who holds it together? As Graham was sort of passing off the scene, and he lived until 2018, he died at the age of 99 years old from 1918 to 2018, 3 months into his 99th year. Could there be another figure that could hold this coalition together? And there really was no figure that rose like a Billy Graham. And in some ways, maybe this splintering of evangelicalism that we see is because there's not that cohesive figure at the center of it to give it some identity. But regardless of whether that's true or not, or helpful or not, the reality is back in the 50s and 60s, Graham was the central figure of this phenomenon of American evangelicalism. Well, besides Carl Henry and Billy Graham, these sort of figureheads of evangelicalism, what's going on in evangelicalism? Well, a British historian by the name of David Bebington has offered an often used paradigm or structure to understand what is the essence of evangelicalism, and he called it the quadrilateral. Now, that's sort of borrowing from the Wesleys. The Wesleys spoke of the Methodist quadrilateral. He was just using that expression of 4 main emphases to describe or to sort of characterize what evangelicalism is. It's come to be called the Bebington quadrilateral. So here are the 4 things. Are you ready? The first is conversionism. Evangelicals stress you must be born again, and the essence of being a Christian is being a follower of Jesus Christ. You must be born again, and you are born again into a life of discipleship. Being a Christian is not being baptized into a certain denomination as an infant, and that's your Christian identity. Being a Christian is not being a member of a particular church. That, and remember, we talked about this word way back in episode number 1. That is nominalism. Well, evangelicals think nominalism is bad, right? So let's just remember that as an evangelical. And instead of nominalism, it's conversionism. And conversionism, well, that's good, all right? So the first of the quadrilateral is conversionism. You must be born again. The second of the quadrilateral, the second feature, is activism. So what is meant by this is that we demonstrate the effect of the gospel through missionary zeal and missionary endeavors, and also through social activism and social activity. So once again, we're seeing this theme that came up in the Second Great Awakening of, as a result of the Second Great Awakening, a flurry of social activism. You also see it among evangelicals. This is the heart of Carl Henry's book, The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism, that we have withdrawn from culture, and meanwhile, culture has gone to Hades in a handbasket. And so we must do something about that. We must step in and see the impact of the gospel on that. And if we recognize that we must be born again, then we must have a missionary zeal for those who've never heard. So conversionism is number one. Activism is number two. The third is this word we've talked about before, biblicism. The third feature of the quadrilateral, biblicism. The Bible as the ultimate authority. Now, again, the Bible as the ultimate authority is true. That is a true statement. The challenge with this is when it evolves to the next phase to say, therefore, we no longer need teachers. I have my Bible and my notebook and my pen and the Holy Spirit, and I have everything I need to know for life and godliness. That's very true of much of evangelicalism. But the Bible itself tells us that God has ordained teachers to help us understand God's Word. And then, as we've mentioned, we need to pay attention to the whole counsel of God. And creeds and confessions can act like guardrails so that we're not just paying attention to our pet verses and not just camping out in those texts that we like, but that we are acknowledging and taking into account the whole counsel of God. But evangelicals are a little allergic to confessions and to creeds. So biblicism. And then fourthly, crucicentrism. In other words, cross-centered, crucicentrism. The necessity of the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. And that was very much at the heart of Billy Graham's messages. This is not Jesus as the example for us. This is Jesus as our necessary substitute. This was very much a part of evangelicalism, an orthodox view of the atonement, that Christ is our penal substitute, that we are under the penalty of the law, and that penalty deserves the wrath of God because our sin is an offense to God Himself. And we must have a substitute because how can we, as a finite creature, ever make a sacrifice worthy of the infinite offense to an infinitely holy God? And so we must have a substitute. So this was at the heart of early evangelicalism. I think we're going to see in our next episode together that in certain branches of evangelicalism, and just like fundamentalism was sort of a coalition with distinct camps, same is true of evangelicalism. So next time together, we're going to look at some of those camps. Very interesting figures. You're going to want to come back to see that one. I'll leave you again with a cliffhanger. But just to say, at its beginnings, this evangelicalism that we're talking about did have some key doctrines at its core as sort of a structure and spine to it. But we're also going to see where there are some areas that can be a little bit tenuous as this evolves into the next couple decades. So that's the beginnings of evangelicalism. Let's come back next time and finish off this story together.